Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Let's get comfy and relaxed and let's begin. Story 1. It all started as a regular weekend trip. 5 of us, me, Jenna, Chris, Alicia, and Mike, packed up Jenna's old RV and hit the road. The plan was simple. Camp for 3 nights at Silver Pines, a secluded campground known for its stunning lake views and dense woods. We'd been planning it for months, excited to escape the noise of the city. But by the second night, we realized we weren't escaping anything. We were walking straight into it. We parked the RV in a quiet corner of the campground, away from the other campers. The trees were thick, casting long shadows that danced in the moonlight. It felt peaceful, quiet. Too quiet, maybe, but we didn't care. We had music, beer, and each other. That night, we stayed up late, laughing and telling ghost stories by the fire. When we finally crawled into our sleeping bags inside the RV, the wind had picked up, rattling the thin walls. It was comforting in a way, like nature was tucking us in. But when I woke up, everything was different. The first thing I noticed was the silence. No wind, no birds, no rustling trees. Just nothing. I rolled out of my bunk and pulled the curtains aside. The campground was empty. Completely empty. The other RVs, tents, picnic tables, all gone. Even the fire pits looked like they'd never been used. It was like we'd dreamed the whole thing. Hey, is this some kind of prank? I called out, but my voice sounded small in the stillness. Jenna stumbled out from the back, rubbing her eyes. What are you yelling about? Look outside, I said. She frowned and stepped to the window. Her face went pale. Where is everyone? She whispered. One by one, the others woke up and gathered by the windows, their faces mirroring Jenna's. Mike, always the skeptic, shrugged it off. Maybe we slept in, and everyone packed up early, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Chris checked his phone. No signal. Alicia tried the GPS on the RV's dashboard. It wouldn't load. Let's just drive out of here, Jenna said, trying to sound confident. Maybe there's an explanation. We piled into the RV, and Jenna started the engine. It roared to life, comforting and familiar. But as we pulled onto the gravel road leading out of the campground, something felt off. We drove for what felt like hours, but the road didn't lead anywhere. No signs, no intersections, just the same winding gravel path. And then we saw it, the spot where we'd camped. At first, we thought we'd made a wrong turn. Jenna cursed, spun the wheel, and headed back the way we came. But after another hour of driving, we were right back at the same spot. This isn't possible, Alicia said, her voice shaking. Mike grabbed a map from the glove compartment, but it was useless. The roads didn't match what we were seeing. Chris tried to laugh it off. All right, who slipped something into the drinks last night? Because this feels like a bad trip. No one laughed. The second loop was worse. The trees seemed darker, the shadows deeper. The air inside the RV grew heavy, stifling. Jenna drove faster, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. And then the RV started acting up. The lights flickered first, just a quick pulse, like a dying bulb. but enough to make us all notice. Then the engine sputtered, jerking the RV forward in uneven bursts. "Jenna, what's going on?" Chris asked, his voice tight. "I don't know," she snapped. "It's like it's fighting me." She wasn't wrong. The wheels seemed to resist her movements, pulling toward the edge of the road. The gas pedal felt sticky, like it didn't want to obey. And then the radio turned on. We hadn't touched it, but suddenly it was blaring static, loud enough to make us all jump. Jenna reached to turn it off, but her hand froze halfway there. The static wasn't just noise anymore. It was a voice. "Stay, stay, stay." It was faint, distorted, but unmistakable. "Turn it off." Alicia screamed, covering her ears. Jenna slammed her hand against the power button, but the radio wouldn't stop. The word "stay" grew louder, more insistent, until finally, Jenna yanked the entire unit out of the dashboard. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. By the third loop, we were unraveling. The RV felt smaller, claustrophobic. The windows didn't show anything familiar anymore, just trees that seemed to press closer with every pass. We stopped to regroup, parking in the same spot we couldn't seem to escape. Mike suggested walking out, but the woods felt wrong. Too still, too dark. "I'm not leaving this RV," Alicia said, her voice trembling. That night, we decided to sleep in shifts. Chris and I took the first watch. He sat by the window, peering out into the dark while I paced the narrow aisle. "Do you feel that?" he asked suddenly. "Feel what?" "The RV. It's moving." I stopped and placed a hand on the wall. He was right. The entire vehicle was trembling like it was alive. And then came the knock. It was soft at first, almost polite. A single tap on the back door. Chris and I froze, staring at each other. The knock came again, louder this time. "Guys, wake up," I hissed, shaking Jenna and Alicia. The knocking turned into pounding, echoing through the RV. And then, without warning, it stopped. We sat in silence, holding our breath. Then Jenna whispered, "Who's driving?" The engine roared to life, and the RV lurched forward. Jenna scrambled to the driver's seat, but the wheel turned on its own. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead as the RV picked up speed. "Make it stop!" Alicia screamed, clutching the back of the seat. "I'm trying," Jenna yelled, wrestling with the wheel. The radio crackled back to life, filling the RV with static. The voice was clearer now, almost gleeful. "Stay forever." The road blurred, the trees melting into black shapes. I don't know how long we drove like that, the RV steering itself, the voice taunting us. When it finally stopped, we were back where we started. The RV door swung open on its own, creaking slowly. Outside, the shadows seemed to ripple, like something was waiting. No one wanted to step out. And then, one by one, the lights inside the RV began to flicker out. We're still here. I'm writing this in the faint glow of my phone screen, but the battery's almost dead. The RV won't let us leave. The voice won't let us leave. If you find this, don't come looking for us. Don't come to Silver Pines. And if you see an empty RV parked in the woods, no matter how inviting it looks, don't get inside. Story 2. We were 3 days into our RV trip. cruising through the kind of forest you only see in horror movies. Tall, looming trees that blocked out the sun, and a road so empty it felt like we were the last people on Earth. The GPS had stopped working hours ago, but Molly, my wife, insisted we were heading the right way. "You trust me, don't you?" she said with a grin, tapping the old paper map we'd brought as a backup. "Always," I replied, though my eyes kept darting to the fuel gauge. We had half a tank left, but out here, half a tank felt dangerously close to empty. That's when we saw her. She was standing at the edge of the road, just where the trees started to swallow the shoulder. A woman, mid-30s maybe, with long, tangled hair and a dress that looked like it had been through hell, mud-streaked and torn in places. She waved frantically as we approached, her eyes wide with panic. "Do we stop?" Molly asked, already reaching for the door handle. I hesitated. Every horror movie I'd ever seen screamed no, but leaving her out there didn't sit right either. "Yeah," I said finally, pulling over. "But let's be careful." The woman ran up to the RV, her face pale and streaked with dirt. Her hands trembled as she grabbed the open passenger door. "Please," she gasped, "I need help. My car broke down back that way. I've been walking for hours." Her voice was raw, desperate. Molly shot me a look that said we couldn't leave her, and before I could say anything, the woman climbed in. "Thank you," she said, collapsing into the seat behind us. "You have no idea." Her voice trailed off, and she pressed her face into her hands. Molly handed her a bottle of water, which she took without looking up. "Where's your car?" I asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "Not far," she muttered. "Just keep going. I'll tell you when to stop." The road stretched on, and the silence in the RV grew thick. Molly tried making small talk, but the woman gave short, clipped answers. Her name was Lila, she said. She'd been on her way to visit family. Her car had broken down just after dark last night. "Last night?" Molly echoed. "You've been out here all night?" Lila nodded but didn't elaborate. Something about her story didn't sit right with me, but I kept driving. Then the first strange thing happened. The door locks clicked down all at once, loud enough to make us both jump. "Did you do that?" Molly asked, her voice tight. "No," I said, glancing at the controls. I hit the unlock button, but nothing happened. The lock stayed down. "It's probably a glitch," Lila said from the back, her tone oddly calm. "Glitch," I muttered, trying to button again. Still nothing. Molly turned in her seat to face Lila. "Are you sure your car's close? We don't have a lot of gas to." The RV shuddered, cutting her off. It felt like we'd hit something, but the road was smooth. I checked the mirrors. Nothing behind us. "What was that?" Molly asked. I didn't answer because I saw it then. A message scrawled in fog on the inside of the windshield. "Don't stop." My blood ran cold. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "See what?" Molly asked, but her eyes were already on the words. She saw it. I glanced at Lila in the rearview mirror. She was staring out the window, completely unfazed. "Lila," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "What's going on?" She didn't answer. "Lila," Molly said, turning fully to face her. But the seat was empty. "Jesus Christ." Molly screamed, scrambling back in her seat. I pulled over, my hands shaking on the wheel. The locks finally clicked open, but we didn't move. "She was right there," Molly said, her voice trembling. She was right. Her words were cut off by a loud bang on the side of the RV, like something heavy slamming into the metal. I grabbed the flashlight from the console and stepped outside, my heart hammering in my chest. The night was eerily quiet. No wind, no animals, nothing. I circled the RV, shining the light into the darkness. When I came back around to the front, Molly was standing in the doorway, pale as a sheet. "There's something on the window," she said. I followed her gaze and froze. On the driver's side window, written in the same foggy script, were the words, "She's not gone. We didn't stay to investigate." I climbed back in, slammed the door, and gunned it. The RV roared down the road, and I didn't stop until we hit the next town. The gas station attendant gave us a strange look when I asked if anyone else had been through that area recently. "Not since the accident," he said, leaning on the counter. "A woman crashed her car out there 2 weeks ago. Poor thing didn't make it." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What would happen to her?" I managed to ask. He shrugged. "They say she was trying to flag someone down, but no one stopped in time. Molly and I left that town as fast as we could. To this day, I can't drive through a forest without checking the rearview mirror. I keep expecting to see her back there, waiting, staring, with that calm, eerie look on her face. And sometimes, when it's cold enough, I swear I can still see those words in the fog." Story 3. It started on the first night. The forest around our RV was silent, unnervingly so. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, not even the distant hoot of an owl. Just stillness. My wife, Sarah, joked that it was the kind of quiet you only find in horror movies. I laughed along, but deep down, it gnawed at me. We had parked the RV in a remote campground near Pine Hollow Woods. The place was supposed to be serene, a perfect getaway from the noise of the city. It wasn't part of a public campground, more of a hidden gem I'd found through a coworker. He swore by its tranquility. "Just you, the trees, and the stars," he'd said. But by the time the sun sank and the forest fell into darkness, that tranquility started to feel more like isolation. I was jolted awake around 2 a.m. by a sound, a faint, whispering voice just outside the RV. At first I thought it was the wind, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. "Do you hear that?" I whispered to Sarah, who was barely stirring beside me. She groaned. "What?" "Voices," I said, sitting up and straining to hear. Sarah turned over. "You're imagining things. Go back to sleep." But I wasn't imagining it. The whispers were growing louder, circling the RV. They didn't sound like words, just tones, hushed, guttural tones that felt wrong. My heart pounded as I slid out of bed and peeked out the window. The dim moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows, but there was no one there. I stood by the window for what felt like an eternity, my breath fogging the glass. The whispers faded, leaving only the oppressive silence again. I eventually convinced myself it was nothing, maybe an echo of our voices inside the RV, or my tired mind playing tricks on me. The next morning, Sarah was her usual chipper self, sipping coffee and admiring the view. I didn't mention the voices. What was the point? I didn't want to sound paranoid. That night, it happened again. This time, Sarah heard it too. "What is that?" she hissed, gripping my arm. We both froze, listening. The whispers were closer now, surrounding us. They didn't stop, didn't waver. "I'm checking it out," I said, grabbing the flashlight from the kitchen drawer. "Are you crazy?" Sarah grabbed my hand. "I'll just take a look around. Maybe it's an animal." But we both knew it wasn't. Animals don't whisper. I stepped outside, the flashlight cutting through the dark. The air was thick and cold, and the silence pressed against my ears like cotton. The whispers stopped the moment I left the RV. I shone the beam into the woods, my heart hammering against my ribs. Shadows danced between the trees, but there was no movement, no sign of life. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. Nothing. I lingered for a moment, then hurried back inside. Sarah was pale, her eyes wide. "Well," she asked. "There's nothing out there," I said, but my voice betrayed my unease. That's when I decided to set up the camera. The next day, I dug out the old trail camera from one of the RV's compartments and mounted it on a tree facing our campsite. It was motion activated, designed for capturing wildlife. I figured if something or someone was out there, the camera would catch it. Night fell, and so did my sense of security. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. Sarah and I huddled in bed, clutching each other like scared children. Neither of us dared to step outside this time. We barely slept. The following morning, I retrieved the camera. My hands were shaking as I plugged the memory card into my laptop. At first, the footage was uneventful, just us sitting by the fire, laughing, talking. Then came the night. The first time the whispers started, the camera didn't pick up much, just a faint rustling of leaves. But then the motion sensor activated. The screen showed the RV in the pale glow of moonlight, silent and still. For a moment, there was nothing, and then movement. A shadow darted between the trees, so fast it was almost imperceptible. Then another, and another. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the shadows gather, circling the RV. And then they stopped. Figures emerged from the darkness. Tall, thin silhouettes with elongated limbs. They didn't walk so much as glide, their movements smooth and unnatural. They surrounded the RV, standing just at the edge of the camera's frame. Then they started moving closer. I slammed the laptop shut, my heart racing. "What is it?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. I couldn't bring myself to show her. "We're leaving," I said. We packed up in record time, the sun barely cresting the horizon as we drove away. But even as we sped down the winding dirt road, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That night, safe in the driveway of our suburban home, I checked the footage again. This time I let it play to the end. The figures didn't leave after we did. They stood there, watching the RV pull away. And then, one by one, they turned to face the camera. The last frame showed them standing just inches from the lens, their faces, or what passed for faces, staring directly into it. They were smiling, and the whispers? They followed us. Story 4. We didn't plan to stay there. It wasn't even on the map. But after hours of driving through endless pine trees and winding back roads, we were desperate. The kids were cranky. My wife, Sarah, was tired, and the sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the forest bathed in an eerie twilight. That's when we saw it. The sign was faded and crooked, the words barely legible. Evergreen RV Park, a place to call home. A long gravel driveway stretched into the trees, leading to a clearing where several RVs sat in neat rows. It looked old but surprisingly well kept. A perfect little spot in the middle of nowhere. "We can stay for the night," I said, pulling in. Sarah gave me a wary look but didn't argue. The kids, Ellie and Jake, were too busy staring out the windows, whispering about how weird it looked. I tried to convince myself it was fine. Just a quiet, empty RV park. People probably came here during the summer, and now it was off season. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves. Just the low hum of our engine as I parked. There was no office, no sign of anyone else. But the park itself seemed frozen, like a picture taken years ago. The picnic tables had no weathering. The gravel paths were perfectly clean, and the RVs were pristine, not a speck of dirt or rust on them. "Strange," Sarah muttered as she stepped out. The kids ran ahead, their voices breaking the silence. Ellie pointed to one of the RVs, a silver Airstream with shiny, mirrored windows. "It's open. Don't go in." I called, but they didn't listen. By the time I reached the Airstream, Ellie and Jake were already inside, their voices echoing. I stepped in after them and immediately felt a chill. The interior was immaculate, like someone had just stepped out to grab something and would be back any moment. There was a table set with plates and silverware, a newspaper folded neatly on the counter. But it was the photos that caught my eye. They were everywhere. Framed pictures on the walls, scattered across the table, tucked into corners. They were all of the same family, a man, a woman, and 2 kids. Something about them made my stomach turn. "Dad," Ellie whispered, tugging at my sleeve. She was holding a photo she'd picked up from the table. This looks like us." I took it from her, my heart skipping. She was right. The man in the picture had my face, down to the small scar on my chin. The woman looked exactly like Sarah, the kids a spitting image of Ellie and Jake. But their clothes were different, older, like they belonged in another decade. "That's impossible," I said, my voice shaking. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her eyes narrowing as she saw the photo in my hand. "What's going on?" I didn't have an answer. Before I could say anything, Jake called out from the back of the RV, "You need to see this." We found him sitting on the bed, holding a journal. It was old, the leather cover cracked and worn. When I opened it, my blood ran cold. It wasn't just a journal. It was a record, our record. Page after page described our journey in eerie detail. The decision to take this road trip, the songs we'd sung in the car, the argument Sarah and I had yesterday about where to stop for gas. Every word was there, written in my handwriting. "This has to be a joke," I said, though my voice betrayed me. Sarah grabbed the journal, flipping through it. "How? How is this possible?" Jake was pale, his eyes wide. "Look at the last page." She turned to the back. The entry was dated that very night. "They've arrived. They've finally come home." A sudden thud shook the RV, Sarah screamed, pulling the kids close. I stepped toward the door, peering out. The park was still empty, but something had changed. The RVs weren't pristine anymore. The paint was peeling, the windows cracked, and the air smelled of rot. "Let's go," I said, grabbing Sarah's arm. We ran back to our own RV, but the gravel path we'd driven it on was gone. In its place was dense forest, the trees so close together that there was no way out. "What do we do?" Sarah whispered, holding the kids tightly. Before I could answer, the lights in the park flickered to life. One by one, the RVs lit up, their windows glowing with a sickly yellow light. Shadows moved inside them, figures watching us. Then the voices started. They came from everywhere, overlapping whispers that grew louder with each passing second. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was clear, mocking, hungry. The journal was still in Sarah's hand. She opened it again, her hands trembling. "There's more," she said, her voice barely audible. I leaned over her shoulder, reading the words that seemed to be appearing as we watched. "You can't leave. You belong to the park now, just like the others." The RV shook violently, and the engine refused to start. The shadows outside grew closer, pressing against the windows. One of them smiled, its face stretched and wrong, like a mask that didn't fit. I don't know how long we've been here now. Days? Weeks? The park doesn't let us leave, and the journal keeps updating, recording everything. I'm writing this down, hoping someone will find it. If you do, stay away from Evergreen RV Park. And if you hear the whispers, it's already too late. Story 5. The highway stretched endlessly in both directions, a ribbon of black asphalt illuminated only by the RV's headlights. I've been driving for hours, my eyes gritty and heavy, when I saw the sign, "Rest area, 2 miles." Relief flooded me. My wife, Marcy, was asleep in the back, and even though our little RV was comfortable, I desperately needed to stretch my legs and clear my head. The rest stop appeared out of the darkness like a mirage. A row of fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a sickly yellow glow over the cracked pavement and a few faded picnic tables. It was desolate, the kind of place that felt like it hadn't seen a human soul in years. I pulled into one of the empty spaces near the restroom building and turned off the engine. The sudden silence was disorienting. I glanced at Marcy, who stirred slightly but didn't wake. I considered waking her up to tell her where we were, but I didn't want to disturb her. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered as I stepped out of the RV. The air was damp and carried the faint scent of mildew, as if the place had been soaked in rain and never properly dried. I stretched, hearing the satisfying pop of my joints, and headed toward the restrooms. That's when I noticed them. At first, I thought they were shadows, tricks of the erratic lighting. But no, there were figures standing under the farthest set of lights, completely still. There were 3 of them, spaced out like silent sentinels. I squinted, trying to make out their features, but their faces were blurred like a camera out of focus. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing faintly in the empty lot. They didn't move. A chill ran down my spine. Something about the way they stood there, so unnaturally still, made my skin crawl. I tried to shake it off. It was late. I was tired, and my imagination had a habit of running wild. I hurried into the restroom, telling myself not to look back. The interior was grimy but functional, with a faint hum of a broken vent fan overhead. I washed my hands quickly, splashing cold water on my face to jolt myself awake. When I stepped back outside, my heart nearly stopped. They were closer. The figures now stood halfway across the parking lot, still motionless, still staring, or at least I thought they were. Their faces were impossible to see, but I felt their gaze like a physical weight. Marcy, I muttered under my breath, my legs already moving toward the RV. The air felt heavier as I approached the vehicle, each step more difficult than the last. My breath quickened, my pulse pounding in my ears. When I finally reached the RV and threw open the door, Marcy was sitting up, her eyes wide and confused. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. "Stay inside," I said, slamming the door behind me and locking it. She looked at me like I'd lost my mind, but before she could ask another question, she noticed them. Her hand flew to her mouth, and her eyes went as wide as saucers. "They're just standing there," she whispered. I turned to look. The figures were now at the edge of the RV's parking space, no more than 20 feet away. They still weren't moving, but I could feel their presence pressing against the thin walls of the RV. "Let's just go," Marcy said, her voice trembling. I didn't need convincing. I fired up the engine, and the headlights washed over the figures. For a split second, I thought I saw their faces. They weren't human, at least not anymore. Their features were twisted, like wax figures left too close to a flame. Empty sockets stared where eyes should have been, and their mouths were fixed in wide, unnatural grins. I slammed the gas pedal, and the RV lurched forward. The figures didn't move to block us, but as we passed them, I swear I saw their heads turn to follow us. The rest stopped, faded into the darkness behind us, but the oppressive feeling lingered. Marcy sat in silence, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrest. I kept my eyes on the road, refusing to look in the mirrors, afraid of what I might see. After a few miles, I let out a shaky breath. "They're gone," I said, more to convince myself than her. Marcy didn't respond. "Marcy," I glanced at her, and my stomach dropped. She was staring straight ahead, her face pale, her eyes unblinking. "Marcy," I said again, my voice rising. She slowly turned to me, and for a horrifying moment, her face wasn't hers. It was one of them, that grotesque, melted visage, grinning at me with hollow eyes. I slammed the brakes, and when I looked again, it was her. Just Marcy. "Why are you stopping?" she asked, her voice shaking. I thought. I couldn't finish the sentence. We didn't stop again that night. Not until the sun rose and the shadows of the highway began to feel less threatening. But even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that we brought something with us. Sometimes, late at night, I'll catch Marcy staring out the window, her face blank, her eyes distant. And sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I'll see figures standing at the edge of the campsite, just beyond the reach of the light. They're always watching, and I know, one day, they'll step closer. Story 6. There was something off about the gas station. I felt at the moment we pulled in, It wasn't just the cracked pavement or the flickering neon sign buzzing faintly against the quiet night sky. It was the way the place seemed to slump into itself, like it was weighed down by something unseen. We were on our way to Pine Hollow, an old campground nestled deep in the forest, far from the noise and chaos of the city. It was my idea. A weekend away in our RV sounded like the perfect escape for me and Julie, a chance to reconnect after months of feeling like strangers in our own home. The gas pump clicked as I filled the tank, the silence around me stretching thin. Inside the station, a single light illuminated the counter. A man stood behind it, his face half hidden in shadow. Julie stayed in the RV, scrolling on her phone, oblivious to the way the air here seemed to press against my skin, heavy and cold. I walked into the gas station, the bell above the door jangling like it hadn't been touched in years. The man behind the counter was older, his face weathered like leather left too long in the sun. His eyes, though, they were sharp, almost too sharp, like they could cut through you if you looked too long. "You heading up to Pine Hollow?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I froze. "Yeah, why?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned forward, his bony fingers drumming on the counter. "That place ain't what it used to be. People go there, thinking they'll find peace. But peace don't come easy in those woods." I let out a nervous laugh, brushing him off. "Thanks for the warning, but we'll be fine. Just looking for a quiet weekend." The old man didn't smile. "You think the forest is quiet, huh? You'll see. If you make it out, you'll see." His words followed me out of the station, sinking into my chest like a stone. Julie laughed when I told her about the man's warning, calling him a superstitious old-timer. I laughed too, but it didn't feel right. Something about his voice stayed with me as we drove into the night, the headlights cutting through the dense, looming trees. By the time we reached Pine Hollow, it was pitch black. We parked the RV in a clearing, the tall pines surrounding us like silent sentinels. Julie went inside to unpack while I stood outside, staring up at the stars. The air was still, almost too still, like the forest was holding its breath. The first sign that something was wrong came just after midnight. Julie and I had settled into bed when I heard it, a faint knocking, like someone tapping their knuckles against the RV door. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Julie stirred, groggy. Probably just the wind, but it didn't sound like wind. It was deliberate, rhythmic. "Knock, knock, knock." I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, expecting to see a raccoon or maybe a stray branch swaying in the breeze. But there was nothing, just the darkness stretching out in every direction, thick and impenetrable. I closed the door, locking it this time. Julie was already asleep again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The knocking came back at 2 a.m., louder this time. When I opened the door again, the flashlight beam caught something. A figure standing just beyond the clearing, half hidden behind a tree. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. It was tall and thin, its outline unnaturally sharp against the shadows. I slammed the door shut, my heart pounding in my chest. "Julie, wake up," I hissed, shaking her. She sat up, groggy and annoyed. "What is it now?" "There's someone out there," I said. But when she looked, the figure was gone. The rest of the night was a blur of restless sleep and half-waking nightmares. I'd hear footsteps crunching outside, whispers that seemed to come from inside the RV, though we were alone. By dawn, I was exhausted, convinced it had all been a bad dream. But then I stepped outside and saw the footprints. They circled the RV, pressed deep into the soil. They weren't human. Julie wanted to leave, but I insisted we stay. I didn't want to admit it, but part of me felt drawn to the place, like the forest wouldn't let me go even if I tried. That night, it started again. The knocking, the whispers, the figure in the trees. Only this time it was worse. Julie screamed when she saw it. A pale face peering through the RV window, its eyes hollow and black. We drove away that night, tearing down the dirt road as fast as the RV could go. But no matter how far we drove, we couldn't escape. We ended up back at the same clearing, the same trees, the same cursed forest. The gas station attendant's words echoed in my mind. You'll see. If you make it out, you'll see. We're still here. No matter how many times we try to leave, the road always brings us back. The nights are longer now, the whispers louder. Julie won't talk anymore. She just stares out the window, her eyes empty. And me? I'm starting to wonder if we ever really left that gas station. Story 7. When I bought the RV, it felt like freedom. No strings, no roots, just me, the open road, and the hum of the tires beneath my feet. I'd spent months dreaming of this. Waking up in the middle of nowhere, coffee steaming in my hand, and nothing but the quiet wilderness around me. But dreams, I've come to learn, have their shadows. It started a few nights into the trip. I'd parked at a secluded campsite deep in the woods. No neighbors for miles. The only light came from the RV's small exterior lamp and the faint glow of the moon through the trees. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I heard it, a faint scratch. It was soft, almost rhythmic, like a mouse scurrying behind the walls. I ignored it at first. Old RV, old problems, I thought. I rolled over and pulled the blanket tighter around me, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But the scratching didn't stop. By the second night, it had grown louder, more deliberate. It wasn't a mouse. It couldn't be. This was heavier, slower, like claws dragging against the wood. I told myself it was probably some animal outside, maybe a raccoon looking for food, but the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside, the back room. Now, calling it a room was generous. It was a cramped storage space, barely big enough to fit a few boxes. I hadn't even opened it since the trip began, figuring I'd deal with whatever was back there once I needed to. But as the scratching continued, I couldn't ignore it any longer. That night, armed with a flashlight and a heavy wrench for courage, I crept toward the back of the RV. The door to the storage room was closed, the small metal latch trembling slightly with each bump in the road. I stared at it for what felt like hours, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to leave it alone. But I couldn't. My hand shook as I unlatched the door and pulled it open. The beam of my flashlight swept over the small space. Empty boxes, a pile of blankets, and nothing else. No rats, no raccoons, no mysterious creatures. Just stillness. Relief washed over me. I laughed at myself, muttering something about my overactive imagination. I shut the door, locked it, and told myself to let it go. But the scratching didn't stop. By the fifth night, it had turned into whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, the way it slipped through the trees, brushing against the thin walls of the RV. It could almost sound like a voice. But this wasn't the wind. These whispers were inside, low and guttural, barely audible, yet impossible to ignore. Let me out. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the driver's seat, engine idling, ready to take off at the first sign of anything. The whispers faded with the dawn, but the memory of them lingered. I decided I'd had enough of this campsite, packed up, and drove until my eyes burned from exhaustion. But the thing about RVs, you can drive as far as you want, but you can't outrun what's already inside. The next night, I parked in a busy lot, surrounded by other travelers. Safety in numbers, I told myself. I'd left the storage room locked and barricaded with a chair for good measure. I tried to convince myself that whatever had been happening was just stress or some strange auditory hallucination. That was when I saw the scratches. They were on the inside of the storage room door. Long, deep grooves, as if someone or something had been clawing to get out. My stomach churned. How could I not have noticed them before? That night I didn't sleep. I sat at the dinette table, staring at the storage room door, flashlight in one hand, wrench in the other. The RV felt smaller, the walls closing in around me. Every creak of the chassis, every groan of the wind sent my heart racing. Then, just past midnight, I heard it. A thud, heavy, deliberate, like someone throwing their weight against the storage room door. I froze, flashlight trembling in my hand. The thudding came again, harder this time, followed by a low, guttural moan. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed with fear, but eventually the noise stopped. When I finally found the courage to approach the door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the flashlight, I noticed something new. The latch was undone. I swear I'd locked it. I know I'd locked it, but now it dangled loosely, the door slightly ajar. My breath hitched as I reached out to pull the door open. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the small space. At first, it looked empty again, just like before, but then I saw it, a pile of blankets shifting ever so slightly. "Hello." My voice cracked, barely a whisper. The blankets moved again, and a hand, a pale, thin hand with jagged nails, slipped out from beneath them. I don't remember screaming. I don't remember bolting for the driver's seat and slamming my foot on the gas. All I remember is looking in the rear-view mirror and seeing the storage room door swinging open and something crawling out, something too long, too thin, with eyes that glinted in the dark. I didn't stop driving until the sun came up, until the gas gauge was nearly empty. I abandoned the RV at a rest stop and walked away, leaving everything behind. I don't know what was in that storage room. I don't want to know, but sometimes, late at night, I think I can still hear the scratching, and I wonder if it followed me. Story 8. I never believed in ghost stories. Not really. Sure, I loved listening to them around the fire, a cup of coffee in hand, the night thick with stars. But believing? That was for suckers and thrill seekers. not someone like me. At least, that's what I thought before the trip that changed everything. We were just four friends looking for a quiet weekend in our RVs. Sam and Jess had their camper. Me and Dave had ours. We picked a spot deep in the woods, the kind of place no one stumbles upon by accident. Sam had found it on some obscure camping forum. A hidden gem, he called it. No crowds, no noise, just nature. The dirt road leading to the campsite was rough, almost deliberately so, as if the forest didn't want us there. When we finally rolled up, the clearing was overgrown but serviceable. There were fire rings scattered around, long abandoned and choked with weeds. A cracked wooden sign nailed to a tree read, "Welcome travelers." The paint was so faded you could barely make out the words. Jess wrinkled her nose. "This place looks like a serial killer's backyard." "Perfect." Sam grinned. "More for us." The first night was uneventful, just the way we liked it. We grilled burgers, laughed too loudly, and swapped ridiculous stories about work and life. It wasn't until the fire burned low that Dave brought up the legend. "So, supposedly," he began, his voice low and theatrical, "this campsite's haunted. You know, classic stuff, ghosts of travelers who vanished without a trace. Supposedly, they wander the woods, looking for people to join them." Jess groaned. "You've been watching too many horror movies." "No, it's true," Dave protested. "The forum Sam found this place on, there were comments about it. People said they heard voices at night, saw strange lights, stuff like that." I rolled my eyes. "You don't think they just made that up to scare people off? Keep the place to themselves." "Maybe," Dave admitted, "but one guy swore he found old belongings scattered in the woods. Shoes, wallets, even keys to an RV." Sam raised an eyebrow. "Keys?" "Yeah," Dave said, lowering his voice even more. "Like they just disappeared without taking anything with them." We all laughed it off, though I couldn't shake a faint unease. Maybe it was the way the shadows danced beyond the firelight, or the oppressive silence of the forest. Whatever it was, it made me glance over my shoulder more than once that night. The first strange thing happened the next morning. Sam's coffee mug was missing. Not a big deal. We assumed he'd left it outside, but when we searched, it wasn't there. Later, Jess's flashlight vanished. Then Dave's favorite hat. We joked about someone sleepwalking, but no one admitted to it. By the second night, the joke stopped. The air felt heavier, thicker, like the woods were closing in around us. Jess swore she saw movement beyond the trees, a pale shape flitting between the trunks. Sam dismissed it as her imagination, but I saw it too. Just a flicker, like a shadow where there shouldn't have been one. We stayed up late, keeping the fire high. Around midnight, a low whistle floated through the trees. It wasn't a bird or the wind. It was deliberate, melodic. It made the hairs on my neck stand up. "Did you hear that?" Jess whispered. We all nodded, too afraid to speak. The whistle came again, closer this time. Dave grabbed the hatchet he'd been using to chop kindling, and Sam picked up a heavy flashlight. The rest of us just huddled together, eyes darting to the tree line. "Probably just some creep messing with us," Sam muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. The third night was when it all fell apart. By then, none of us wanted to stay, but the RVs wouldn't start. Both batteries were dead. We tried calling for help, but there was no signal. It was like the forest itself had decided to trap us. That night, we heard footsteps circling the RVs, slow and deliberate. Every so often, we'd hear a faint laugh, high-pitched and distant. Sam and Dave took turns patrolling with their flashlights, but they didn't find anything. Just empty woods and the oppressive sense of being watched. Around 2 a.m., Jess screamed. We ran to her RV, where she was pointing to the window. On the fog glass, there were handprints. Small, child-sized handprints. But there were no children here. No one but us. And then we saw it. In the firelight, just beyond the clearing, stood a figure. At first, I thought it was a person, a hiker, maybe. But the longer I looked, the less human it seemed. Its limbs were too long. Its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being yanked by invisible strings. It tilted its head at us, and I swear I heard it laugh. High, wheezing, and utterly inhuman. "Get in the RV," Dave shouted, slamming the door behind us. We locked the doors and windows, turned off the lights, and sat in the dark, clutching whatever makeshift weapons we could find. Outside, we heard the thing moving around, dragging something heavy. Then came the scratching, long, deliberate scrapes of nails or claws against the metal of the RV. It didn't try to break in, just circled us, letting us know it was there. The rest of the night was a blur of terror. I don't know when I fell asleep, but when I woke, the sun was rising. The figure was gone. The handprints on the RV had vanished. We didn't bother packing. We just piled into the RVs and tried the engines one last time. They started without a hitch. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The clearing was empty, except for one thing. My coffee mug, sitting in the middle of the fire ring, filled with something dark and thick, like blood. We never spoke about it after that. None of us went camping again. And late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I sometimes hear that whistle, faint and far away, but getting closer. Story 9. We'd always dreamed of a road trip across the country. My wife, Ellen, and I weren't exactly adventurers, but the idea of cruising down endless highways, camping under the stars, and waking up to the smell of coffee in the wilderness sounded like a slice of heaven. That's why we bought the RV. It wasn't new, far from it. Actually, the man who sold it to us described it as vintage, which we both knew was a polite way of saying old and barely holding together. Still, it had charm. The faded decals of mountains and sunsets on its sides, the little kitchenette that smelled faintly of burnt toast, even the squeaky fold-out bed. It all felt like the beginning of an adventure. The first few days on the road were uneventful. We laughed at how out of practice we were with driving such a bulky vehicle, took pictures of roadside attractions, and marveled at how freeing it felt to leave our lives behind, if only for a while. But by the fourth night, things started to feel off. It began with the lights. We were parked at a quiet rest stop, far from any town. Ellen had gone to bed early, and I stayed up reading. The overhead lights flickered once, twice, and then shut off completely. I groaned, thinking it was just a blown fuse. But before I could get up to check, they snapped back on, only brighter this time, painfully bright, like staring into the sun. "Ellen," I called, but she didn't answer. I made my way to the bedroom, only to find her fast asleep, completely unaware of the blinding light outside. When I returned to the main cabin, the lights had dimmed back to normal, as if nothing had happened. The next morning, I chalked it up to faulty wiring, something I'd have to fix when we got to the next town. Ellen didn't even notice when I mentioned it, brushing it off as me making a big deal out of nothing. But then the brakes failed. We were coming down a steep hill, one of those winding mountain roads with no guardrails. I hit the brakes to slow us down, but the pedal went straight to the floor. No resistance. Nothing. Hold on, I shouted, gripping the wheel with both hands as the RV picked up speed. Ellen screamed, clutching the armrest as we barreled around a corner, the tires skidding dangerously close to the edge. Just when I thought we were going to plummet into the valley below, the brakes suddenly kicked back in. The RV jerked to a violent stop, throwing us forward in our seats. I jumped out, shaking, to inspect the vehicle. The brake lines were intact. Everything looked fine, but I knew what I'd felt, or rather, what I hadn't. By the time we reached a small town that evening, I was ready to trade the RV in for a plane ticket home. Ellen convinced me otherwise. It's an old vehicle, she reasoned. Old things have quirks. Besides, we're halfway through the trip. We can't just give up now. Reluctantly, I agreed. That night, parked at a secluded campground, the RV came alive. It started with the radio. Static blared from the speakers, loud enough to wake us both. I stumbled out of bed, fumbling to turn it off, but the knob wouldn't budge. Then the lights began flickering again, casting the interior in a sickly, strobe-like glow. "What's happening?" Ellen cried, clutching my arm. Before I could answer, the engine roared to life. The RV jerked forward, its tires spinning in place as if trying to break free of the parking brake. I threw open the door, intending to jump out and pull the power, but the door slammed shut in my face, nearly breaking my nose. "This isn't possible," I muttered, my voice shaking. And then I saw it. In the reflection of the windshield, just for a moment, I saw a face. Pale, twisted, and watching me with a grin that sent ice through my veins. The next morning, we decided to dig into the RV's history. We found a library in town and spent hours combing through old newspapers, desperate for answers. What we discovered made my blood run cold. The RV had once belonged to a man named Gerald Klein, a loner who'd spent years living on the road. Locals described him as odd, but harmless, until the night he drove his RV into a crowded diner, killing 12 people, including himself. Witnesses claimed he'd been smiling when he hit the gas, his eyes wide and unblinking. After the accident, the RV was impounded, but no one wanted to buy it. The seller we bought it from must have left that part out. Ellen wanted to leave it at the library and never look back, but I couldn't. I had to know. That evening, I drove it to an empty lot just outside of town. Ellen refused to come with me. I sat in the driver's seat, staring at the dashboard. The RV hummed softly, like it was alive and waiting. "What do you want?" I whispered. The radio crackled to life, and through the static, I heard a voice, low, guttural, and filled with rage, to finish what he started. Before I could react, the doors locked, the engine revved, and the RV lunged forward. I wrestled with the wheel, trying to regain control, but it was useless. The RV seemed to have a mind of its own, steering straight for the highway. I don't know how I survived that night. Somehow, I managed to jump out, rolling into the dirt as the RV sped off into the darkness. They found it 2 days later, crashed into an abandoned barn miles away. The police told me I was lucky, that I should count my blessings. But I don't feel lucky. Sometimes, late at night, I hear it, the faint hum of an engine, the crackle of static on the radio. And I wonder if it's out there, still looking for its next victim. Story 10. We'd been planning the trip for months. A group of 6 RV enthusiasts, craving an escape from the grind of daily life. The pictures of the campground had promised stunning views. Rolling hills, towering trees, and a lake so clear you could see the rocks on the bottom. It was remote, exactly what we wanted. No cell service, no distractions. Just nature, campfires, and good company. We arrived just before sunset, our convoy of RVs rolling down the gravel road, kicking up dust that shimmered in the golden light. The place was perfect. No other campers, not a single soul in sight. The site was wide open, the kind of postcard-worthy scenery that made you feel lucky to be alive. The air smelled of pine and damp earth as we parked the RVs in a loose semicircle. We joked about how quiet it was, that kind of quiet where the world seems to hold its breath. But none of us minded. The first night was everything we'd hoped for. We built a roaring campfire, roasted marshmallows, and traded ghost stories. The stars above us were so bright, it felt like you could pluck them out of the sky. It wasn't until the next morning that things started to feel off. We packed up early, ready to hit a nearby trail we'd heard about. But when we turned the RVs back toward the gravel road, something strange happened. After driving for 10 minutes, we found ourselves back in the same spot we'd just left. "It's got to be a wrong turn," Brad said, his voice light, though his brow was furrowed. He was leading the convoy in his massive Class A rig. "Let's try again." We retraced our steps, taking a different fork in the road this time. The scenery was the same, and we all felt a flicker of relief when we recognized the gravel road that had led us here the night before. But when we followed it, the same clearing appeared. Same picnic tables, same fire pit, same semicircle of RVs. "What the hell?" Lisa said from the passenger seat of my RV. Her voice had a nervous edge to it now, one I didn't like. "We must have missed something," I replied, though I didn't believe it myself. 3 more tries, 3 more failures. Each time, the road looped us right back to the clearing. By noon, the laughter and jokes had dried up, replaced by confusion and a gnawing sense of unease. Brad got out a map. Lisa and I used the compass app on her phone. Nothing worked. "Maybe we should just stay another night," Emma suggested. She was Brad's wife, a practical sort who never panicked. "We're obviously missing a turn. Maybe we'll have better luck in the morning." No one liked the idea, but no one had a better one either. So, we stayed. The day passed slowly. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. At first, I chalked it up to paranoia, but every time I glanced at the woods, I swore I saw movement. Just out of the corner of my eye, shapes flitting between the trees. Lisa noticed it too. "Do you see that?" she whispered, gripping my arm as we stood outside the RV, watching the sun dip lower. I wanted to say no, but I couldn't. By the time the sun set, the air felt heavy, oppressive. The campfire's warm glow did little to cut through the darkness. Shadows seemed to creep closer, thick and tangible. And then we heard it, a low, guttural whisper carried on the wind. It wasn't words, not exactly, just a sound that made your skin crawl and your stomach churn. What was that? Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Probably just the wind, Brad said, though his hand hovered near the hatchet he'd brought for chopping firewood. But it wasn't the wind. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Shapes began to emerge from the tree lean, tall and spindly, their limbs too long, their movements jerky and unnatural. Their faces, or what passed for faces, were pale, featureless ovals that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. No, no, we're leaving, Brad said, his voice shaking as he grabbed Emma's arm and started toward their RV. But when we tried to start the engines, none of them turned over. Batteries dead, all of them. The shadows kept coming, surrounding the clearing, their whispers now a cacophony of incomprehensible sounds. They didn't move like they were walking. They glided, their legs barely touching the ground. Lisa was crying. I'd never seen her cry before, and it terrified me more than the things outside. What do they want? She sobbed. I don't know, I whispered, pulling her close. I don't know. We barricaded ourselves inside the RVs, locking every door and window. The whispers turned to scratching, soft at first, then more frantic. I peeked through the curtains, my breath hitching as one of the figures pressed its face against the glass. Its mouth was a gaping black hole, opening and closing like it was trying to speak. But no sound came out, just that awful scratching. The night felt endless. When dawn finally broke, the shadows vanished, melting back into the woods as if they'd never been there. But the fear didn't leave us. We tried the engines again, and this time they roared to life. No one spoke as we drove down the gravel road, all of us praying it wouldn't lead us back. It didn't. We never found that campground on a map, and none of us ever went camping again.